Welcome back. So in this video, we're essentially going to finish off our brick pattern, turn it into something that looks a little bit more like brick. We're going to have a gap between our bricks. We're going to have the ability to round off the corners and add a little profile on those. And we'll also set up those controls that I discussed in the last video for changing this value, which is our width to height ratio, and our offset. So let's do that first. This is going to be very, very quick. What I need is a combine XYZ node. And we're going to put this up here. And we're going to plug this into here. So we need our values of 3 and 1. So we'll just grab those values just now. We'll plug this in here and we shouldn't see any change. And we don't see any change. Now we have two values here that we need to think about. Let's just move these a little bit. We have a value of 1.5, which is half of 3. And we have this value of 3. So let's grab a math node. So converter, math. We'll put this in here and we're going to set this to divide. We're going to divide by 2. We're going to duplicate this node. And we're going to put this here. And this is going to be a multiply node with a value of 1. And the reason we're using a multiply node in here is so that we can eventually plug this first value into our node group. And in here, we're going to use a value of 3. That's going to be our ratio. So 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. So this goes into our multiply node. And this 3 value goes directly into this X channel here. Now let's just tidy this up by adding a little redirect in here. Maybe we can move this down as well so it's a little bit cleaner. There we go. So now what we have is we have a value of 3 in here, and if we increase this, our offset will increase accordingly so that our bricks are always offset by exactly half of a brick. Let's change that back to 3. Now the next step that I spoke about in the last video was we have our UV spaces with a 0, 0 value in this bottom left hand corner, and eventually we want this value to be right in the center of our bricks, so that we can rotate around the center of our bricks to give our bricks a little bit of a rotation, a little bit of a tilt in the X, Y, and Z axes. And this is going to allow us to create a brick wall that's not perfect. It's going to have bricks at different angles, slightly different tilts and variations, and it's going to make our brick walls a lot more interesting. But in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to take the values that are within this vector and we need to shift them by half a brick to the right and half a brick up. And the way we'll do that is with some more vector math. So let's take this modulo texture. Let's use Shift D and duplicate that. And we'll change this to a subtract. Now what we need to subtract from this is half of the values going into this combine XYZ node, 3 and 1. So what we can do is we can just take this modulo node, we're going to duplicate it down here, and we're going to scale this. We're going to scale by 0.5. That has the effect of halving this. So we'll take this combine XYZ node, plug it in here, and now if we plug this into our vector, so we've essentially centered that on our X, Y, and Z axis. So now we have our vectors for the center of our bricks. Now, if we were to take a separate X, Y, Z node, now what we have is we have some negative values on the left-hand side of the brick and then positive values on the right hand. And if we go to our Y-axis, we have negative values at the bottom of our brick and positive values at the top. Ideally, we like all our values to be positive. So let's take out that separate XYZ node. Again, we'll look at our vectors here, and we're going to use another vector math node. And this tool we're going to use is absolute. Now what absolute does, it essentially just takes off any negative sign in front of any number and makes it a positive number. So when we do that, all sectors of our brick now become positive. We no longer have negative values. Now, running right down the center of our brick, left and right, we still have 0 values in there. Ideally, again, we'd like to shift those 0 values to the outside of our bricks. Now, if we look at this from a distance, you can still see the brick shape, but what might be a little bit off-putting is that this spot in the middle is actually the center of a brick. It's not the side of the brick. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this green gradient is actually the edges of our bricks, but that edge is actually right in the center of this area here, and that can be a little bit off-putting. Now, if we were to take something like a separate XYZ node and look at it now, and we look at these gradients, this one in particular makes it really seem like this is the bottom of a brick, and that's the top, and in the x-axis, that this is the side of a brick, and this is the center of the brick, but it's not actually that way at all. So again, we have to do a little bit more vector math, and again, it's going to be another subtraction. So we're going to duplicate this node across here, but instead of putting this absolute into the top, we're actually going to put that into the bottom. And the value that we're going to take this from is actually going to be this scale again. So again, the math can be a little bit tricky. You can logic it out on your own to see what happens, but we essentially go from this to this. And if we grab a separate XYZ node and look at that, now our gradients have essentially shifted to the edges of our bricks. So these dark areas are now at the edges of our bricks, and that's going to make a lot more sense. So if we were to grab something like a math node, plug it in here, and just look at both of these values together, and maybe use something like multiply, you can just about see we're getting a nice pattern there. But this math node is not super useful for this process. As you can see, we do have our grout there. We can almost see a rounded edge, but we're not getting enough contrast for this multiply node to work the way we want. So instead of a multiply node, we are going to change this over to a smooth minimum. Now with this smooth minimum node, we're essentially taking in two values, and we are finding the minimum value between these two values, and we're smoothing it with this distance. So with zero distance, we have no smoothing, and essentially the value we're getting is the lowest value in each of these two gradients in X and in Y. And because we have that smoothing, it's going to have the effect of smoothing out these corners. And that's going to come in really handy if we want bricks that have a slightly curved corner. And we can take this value up and down as much as we want. For the moment, I'll take that to about 0.15. But you can see on the top of our brick, we have this lighter value, and we actually almost have these corners going off to the side. If we use that for our brick, we're not going to get flat bricks. We're going to get bricks that stick out from the wall and are a lot higher in the middle. We'll have a kind of triangular edge on them and two planar surfaces. And we don't really want that. So again, we have to manipulate this a little bit more. Now, instead of a math node, what we're going to do is we use a color, mixed color node. We'll plug this in here. And the setting we're going to use here is color burn. So you can see what color burn does here. It is essentially giving us a factor that we can use for the width of our grout or the mortar or the gaps between our bricks, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to take this to a value of about 0.1. So we have pretty big gaps there. So this color burn node is going to end up being our grout width. Now you want to make sure this value in B is at 0.5. And I think we spoke about color burn earlier on in the course, but it's one of these blending modes that is a little bit hard to explain. Now you can certainly look up the Blender manual to find some information on exactly what color burn does at a mathematical level, but it essentially takes two values, in this case the A value and the B value, it inverts one of them, it multiplies by another one, and it re-inverts it at the end. The short story is it takes a smooth minimum and it gives us a really dark edge, which we can then bring up and down using this factor, depending on how much of this grey value we are adding into it, or in this case, I believe multiplying into it, and I believe it's an exponential multiplication. Again, that's fixed our grout, but we haven't flattened out the top of our bricks. So again, we're going to use another blending mode that's a little bit tricky to explain. We're going to duplicate that, and we're going to change this to color dodge. And the value here we want in our slot B is a value of 1. So we'll change that all the way to 1. And now if we increase this factor, you can see that brightens up our brick, and you can just about see a rectangle appearing where we now have a planar surface, and we can move that right to the edge. Now with this all the way up at 1, we have a perfect mask for our grout. Now if we take this down a little bit and we add a little bit of a gradient to our edge, we're now getting a nice edge profile on our brick. And that essentially takes us to the end of our brick generator. At this point, we almost have the exact same functionality as the brick texture node that's native to Blender, but we also have the ability to round off the corners and add a more interesting profile. Now the next step for this brick node is to add in controls to tilt and rotate our bricks, and we'll do that in the next video. I'll see you then.